Equity. Big concept of equity in individuals and societies. One of the most common analogies is the fence analogy. So here we have two groups of people and two fences. And the difference here, you can see, is the step. Right? So in this case, we have three people of different heights, all trying to look over the fence. Maybe they're trying to look at a TV or a sporting game, or who knows. And the idea is the same game, the same rules. So this is fairness. This is equality. Right? Because they all have the same, they're all standing on the same ground. But is this fair? And so then equity is more this second fence, where once again it's a fence, there's the different natural attributes, in this case height, but then for each person they receive what they need to succeed, and so they can all equally see over the fence. So here we have equal opportunity, here we have equal outcome. And so what is the best way to promote fairness in a society? Equality or equity, as in the second image? Okay, so we're going to look at equity in the context of aid in a globalized world. So aid, where you give help to someone. And so in this case, usually it's richer countries giving to poorer countries. Okay, so why? Who, how, and what of aid? So the why, four main kind of purposes: humanitarian or short-term aid. So in the case of a natural disaster like flood relief or earthquake relief, where food, water, shelter is brought in, experts are brought in, etc. Development is more long-term aid. So in the case of providing water pumps or infrastructure, building schools, hospitals, etc. Geopolitics. So here we have possibly more selfish motivation by donor countries, where they're protecting their interests and their resources. So here we might have, for example, oil. So Iran or Iraq might get more aid than countries that don't have oil. And protect interests, maybe former colonies, say France giving more aid to Algeria than to other countries. And trade, so to try and boost up, improve a market for their own products in the future. So as another why for aid. So who? So you can look at the who and the where of aid through quantitative and qualitative data. So in terms of quantitative, it's the statistics. It's the total funds. You could look at the UN, the United Nations, and see which countries contribute and how much. So I think the US is about 20% of all UN contributions to aid that's then distributed. Or you could look at country data and the percentage of their GDP that they give, the countries that they provide to, etc. You can also look at it qualitatively. So the stories, the case studies, where you look at specific projects, communities, people. And so these two together, as usual, provide that fuller picture of quantitative and qualitative data. The how. We have bilateral and multilateral aid. So bilateral is the direct country to country, where a donor country is giving to another country. Multilateral is through the vehicle of a supranational organisation. So you think of the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, where countries, contribute to an organisation who then make decisions and have agencies to then operate, and deliver the aid. What? So what are the different types of aid? And we're thinking about particularly this for the concept of equity. So as we're thinking about these things, particularly the why and now the what, how does that relate back to fairness? How does that relate back to giving people what they need to succeed? Okay, so 4 types: tied, loans, grants, and gifts. So tied aid is where you use the aid, or where they have to use the aid, to buy goods from the donor. So for example, Canada gives tied aid to Ethiopia, and they have to use that money to buy Canadian wheat. There's loans, where you're given the aid, but then you have to pay it back over time with interest. Now this is quite controversial, as then countries sometimes end up paying more in interest to pay off their debts from the past aid than they do receive from aid itself. Grants. Here we have conditional investment. So it might be the country has to enact democratic reforms. They have to implement elections, and then they can have aid from a country. And then finally, gifts. Sort of no strings attached or low strings attached aid. So here we have aid demonstrating, in the concept of equity and how that kind of goes. So some big debatable questions. How should societies promote fairness? Equality or equity? Okay, so this idea of same game, same rules for all, equality or equity, giving to those what they need to succeed. To what extent does aid actually redistribute global wealth? And I guess when you're thinking about tied, loans, grants, and gifts, it gives you a sense of, well, how far is aid reducing inequality, or is it reinforcing inequalities and keeping poor countries poor? And so aid becomes quite a debatable topic, and how far it does lead to equitable outcomes. To what extent is aid used as a weapon to boost trade, as we saw here with trade being a key motivation? And so countries choosing where they put their aid, and particularly as it relates to possible markets for their products. And B, further their political aims. So say during the Cold War, countries that were more democratic and resisting communism would have received aid from the US. Countries like Cuba, obviously no aid and a cut-off from trade and other things. And we have at the moment Iran with its nuclear, with the deal, say don't produce any more nuclear, don't be enriching uranium, etc. And so all the countries, Europe, the US, etc., said, okay, so we'll trade with you. But then the US, for its own political aims, kind of ripped up that agreement. So obviously that's trade, but then aid also comes in there. North Korea as well, as a bigger example in terms of aid, through its weakening, its weak economy, often starving people, and when they are offered aid to achieve political aims, or when it's withheld, or other reasons. And then, do rich countries receive more in interest repayments than they give in aid? So quite a provocative question that is asked by lots of commentators on aid. So how far is aid really a business scam by rich countries for this loaning out of money and getting the interest in return? So okay, a few options of ways to explore this further. Design a brochure to promote an aid project. So here you're thinking about qualitative case studies. You're zooming in on a specific community project and thinking about why it's there, and trying to promote these aims, and relating it to some of these questions in hopefully a favourable light. Second option, justify an aid contribution to a donor's parliament. So here you write a speech and you try and identify, why this aid is being given, how it fits, what kind of aid it is, and how it relates to these debatable questions in a positive manner. And the third option is to use the 6 thinking hats to critically think about aid. So using this ATL skill of critical thinking, where you identify the facts with the white hat, the organisation of aid. Who organises? Possibly you can look at the United Nations for this, or another supranational organisation. The yellow and black hats for the pros and cons of aid. The red hat for emotions, which obviously with something like aid, particularly when it comes to humanitarian aid and disasters and other things. And obviously some of these debatable questions are quite emotive. What are the emotions? How do local farmers feel about aid organisations coming and bringing free food to areas? Does it destroy their market for crops? Etc. And green, creative solutions to try and minimise some of these black hats of aid and move forward to a more sustainable future. So we've considered the concept of equity in the knowledge area of aid with some really debatable questions that comes back to us of what does it mean to be compassionate, caring people seeking to make the world a better place, but in a really critically aware manner. What aid is good aid?